This is part 2 of our discussion of sentence types. We previously discussed simple and compound sentences, and in this video we'll talk about the final 2 sentence types. Those are complex and compound complex sentences. Plus we'll also talk about dependent clauses and subordinating conjunctions, 2 terms we have to define if we're going to talk about complex and compound complex sentences. So a quick review of independent clauses. An independent clause has both a subject and a main verb, and B, it expresses a complete thought. So in all of these sentences below, we have a subject and a verb, and it can be a compound subject or a compound verb as well, but we'll still have one thought expressed, one independent clause. Jesus wept, our shortest sentence, subject and verb. That's the shortest way you can construct a complete sentence, a subject and an intransitive verb. But we can also have compound subjects or compound verbs like the other 2 examples below. Tom and Rob, compound subject, went to court. Jack, subject, butters and toasts, compound verb, his bagels, direct object. And again, a little more review on simple sentences and compound sentences. A simple sentence is an independent clause by itself. But when you combine 2 independent clauses with a semicolon or a coordinating conjunction, and the coordinating conjunctions you can remember by the acronym FANBOYS, F-A-N-B-O-Y-S, that stands for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so, you create a compound sentence. 2 or more independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. So what's a dependent clause? Well, a dependent clause standing alone is the same as a sentence fragment. It may have a subject and verb in it, but it does not express completely the thought that it has begun. So in the examples below here, the parenthetical D after each phrase is a dependent clause, and the parenthetical I is an independent. Before I go to work, dependent clause, I eat a good breakfast, independent. Before I go to work cannot stand alone. It does not complete the thought that it's begun. While I eat a good breakfast can stand as its own sentence. It's an independent clause. The surfer fell can stand alone. As the wave crashed down cannot stand alone. That's the dependent clause. The dependent clause being dependent upon the independent clause to make sense. While Bob ate all the food, dependent, Rhonda looked on in horror. All of those are examples of complex sentences. A complex sentence is one independent clause plus at least one dependent clause. So the example sentences again, before I go to work, I eat a good breakfast, and on and on. Each has at least one independent clause. It has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. And remember that an independent clause can support multiple dependent clauses, and it'll still be a complex sentence. So in the example at the bottom here, we have 2 dependent clauses dependent upon one independent. The surfer fell, independent, can stand alone as its own sentence. As the wave crashed down, dependent, because he was on top of it. You may notice that the first words of each of those dependent clauses are the part that make them dependent. They're the part that prevent them from completing a whole thought. So these words are called subordinating conjunctions. Those are words that make a clause dependent to another one. So they are what make the clause subordinate to another clause. So before I go to work, before is the subordinate conjunction. Surfer fell as the subordinate conjunction, the wave crashed down. And while is a subordinate conjunction. There are a lot of subordinating conjunctions in the English language. In our definition here, to say it directly, a subordinating conjunction begins a dependent clause, making it subordinate to the sentence's main independent clause. There are a bunch of them. Here are some of the most common: after, although, as far as if, as long as. All of these words at the beginning of a clause make it dependent on an independent clause to make sense. They make it subordinate to an independent clause. When, subordinate clause, I get the leash, subordinate conjunction, excuse me, I get the leash makes a dependent clause. The dog gets excited, independent clause. I will stay here, independent clause, until subordinate conjunction. Melissa comes home, dependent clause. Incomplete thought, dependent clause. There's a good grammatical rule to keep in mind. If a sentence begins with a dependent clause, use a comma after the dependent clause before the independent one. So before I go to work, comma, I eat a good breakfast. While Bob ate all the food, comma, Rhonda looked on in horror. But if the independent clause comes after the independent clause, you don't need a comma. The surfer fell as the wave crashed down. Rhonda looked on in horror while Bob ate all the food. There are a few rare exceptions to that rule, especially as they come into contact with the word because. Because is a bit of a strange beast, but for the most part, this rule will hold true. If a sentence begins with a dependent clause, use a comma after it. If the independent clause precedes the dependent clause, you do not need a comma. So those are complex sentences, an independent clause and at least one dependent clause. And the fourth of our sentence types here is the big one, a compound complex sentence. And a compound complex sentence is exactly what it says. We've already studied compound sentences and we've studied complex sentences. And if you put them together, you get a compound complex sentence. At least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. So Tony hates algebra and Tom hates history while Julie loves both subjects. So you see we have an independent clause first, Tony hates algebra. We have a coordinating conjunction and Tom hates history, another independent clause. While our subordinating conjunction, Julie loves both subjects, becomes a dependent clause. So we have two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. And another way to think of it is the first half of that sentence is a compound sentence, just as we've already studied, two independent clauses joined with a coordinating conjunction. And the last half of the sentence is a dependent clause. And you can make some pretty long and drawn out, very compound complex sentences with this construction. You can see how many different dependent clauses can be supported by different independent clauses. In this bottom sentence, we have three independent clauses and two dependent clauses. After we cleared the weeds, that's dependent. Before we stopped for the day, dependent. Tom planted corn, independent. And our coordinating conjunction, Julie planted carrots, independent. So, another coordinating conjunction, we will have a good harvest next fall, independent.